I'm Scott Alexander, and in this video series, I'll be discussing another controversial aspect of Maimonides' thought. Why did Maimonides write his 26 Propositions of Aristotelian philosophy? This is the first of a series of 8 short videos meant to briefly explain the propositions and to clarify each one of them. This series is based on my new commentary essay on Maimonides' Introduction to Volume 2 of the guide, which you can find at maimonides-guide.com. Maimonides' Introduction is where he summarized the main achievements of philosophy in 26 succinct propositions. These 26 propositions and Maimonides' treatment of them will turn out to be a pinnacle of Jewish medieval thought, of philosophy, of theology, and of science. We won't understand Book 2 of the guide until we have a good sense of those propositions. Unfortunately, for various reasons, few grasp their meaning. First, I want you to notice that the propositions form the introduction to Volume 2 of the guide. And when you read Maimonides, pay close attention to his introductions. He always makes these the centerpiece of his writing. Indeed, his introduction to the Guide of the Perplexed as a whole, opening with his letter to Rabbi Joseph, is the best and most important chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed, and its most spectacular. In this video, I will explain his second introduction to Volume 2 of the guide with its 26 propositions of philosophy, and I'll explain why people find it difficult to study. Although this section of the guide is not studied in the Jewish schools, it is nonetheless critical to understanding what Maimonides thought the relation of religion and philosophy was. It should also interest philosophy students who grasp that Aristotle and his scholastic successors are important, but who haven't gone through their physical and metaphysical doctrines. The 26 propositions were vastly influential on world scholasticism, both Christian and Jewish scholasticism, and much later philosophy and theology. Here, Maimonides summarizes the main achievements of 1,000 years of philosophical development in a mere 3 pages in the Judeo-Arabic original. What drove Maimonides to the study of philosophy? The reason is that theology, which in his day was mainly the theology of the Kalam theologians, failed in its primary mission. Now, the Kalam is the Muslim term for theology, and it represents a certain specific theological method. This theology would have been expected to justify the 4 bedrock requirements of religion that Maimonides had established in Volume 1 of the guide that anyone who had any sense of religion must subscribe to: God's existence, God's incorporeality, God's unity, and his creation of the universe from nothing, creation ex nihilo. All religious believers, according to Maimonides, have to understand and accept these 4 principles. But the theologians failed to effectively justify them. For that reason, Maimonides had rejected the Muslim Kalam opponents in the last several chapters of the guide. Their theological proofs for these 4 requisites were shattered by their failure to grasp the true nature of reality. Those Muslim theologians include the so-called Jewish Kalam of Rabbi Saadia Gaon and Rabbi Bachya ibn Bakuda. Why did Maimonides reject the doctrine of the Kalam theologians? He rejected them because they made creation first in the list of the 4 necessary beliefs, instead of making belief in God's existence first. They made creation of the universe from nothing first in the list of those 4 necessary dogmas, because they thought that they could only prove the existence of God by first proving the creation of the universe. Their theory simply was that, given creation, there must be a creator. But since there is no Loctite proof for creation, and indeed creation is unprovable, their method left the existence of God in the lurch. By making the existence of God depend on whether the world was created rather than eternal, undermined belief in God, especially since the issue between creationism and eternalism was so balanced. Those first three of those four requirements are the most important, since they're about God and the nature of divine being. Maimonides now turns to explain how at least those first three of those bedrock requirements of religion, God's existence, incorporeality, and unity, could be proven from Aristotle's philosophy. They're so important, according to Maimonides, that the fourth prerequisite, creation, could be put on the back burner, so to speak, to deal with later. The key here was that the philosophers accepted the first three requisites of divine existence and were capable of providing an effective justification of them, which the theologians failed to do. To make this case succinctly and summarily, so his readers wouldn't have to spend long years learning the intricate arguments of Aristotle and his successors, Maimonides compressed that doctrine into his 26 Aristotelian Propositions. However helpful philosophy was to Maimonides, though, there was still the fourth requirement of religion, the belief that God created the world from nothing, which the philosophers rejected. Maimonides would eventually have to address this issue. The reason he'd have to address it was that the Torah's doctrine of creation was directly in conflict with Aristotle's core doctrine of eternalism. Maimonides summarizes that eternalism as his 26th proposition in the list. But he will have to eventually reject that doctrine, which he does in 10 upcoming chapters in Volume 2 of the guide. But his rejection of eternalism comes after first tactically, temporarily, assenting to it. We will come back to his clever tactic of assenting to it shortly. Because the Aristotelians accepted and effectively justified the first three principles of religion, irrespective of whether the world was created, they were a great improvement over the theologians. But their rejection of that fourth principle, creation ex nihilo, destroyed belief in divine transcendence. Only a transcendent God, a God outside of and apart from the universe, could have created it from nothing. Of these two dangers, the Kalam's basing God's existence on the creation of the world, and philosophy's rejection of creation and, therefore, of divine creative transcendence, Maimonides recognized that the Kalam's danger was worse. That was because Maimonides could handle the problem of the philosophers. He could show that the Aristotelians' doctrine of eternalism was unprovable. He could also show that there were very strong arguments for creationism. Still, since the philosophers had no problem with the first three requirements of religion, their path was superior to the theologians who sacrificed God on their need to prove creation. Maimonides was justly famous for his ability to succinctly summarize vast areas of learning in clear propositions. He did this with the Kalam theology in the 12 Kalam propositions of Guide 73, Chapter 73 in Volume 1, as well as for the oral and written law of Judaism in his Mishneh Torah. He says that these propositions truly represent the Aristotelian arguments for the existence, unity, and incorporeality of God, by which he means that he had truly summarized them. And by Aristotelian, I mean to register that these propositions summarize not only what Aristotle wrote in his Physics, Metaphysics, and other works, but it also reflects over 1,000 years of commentary and debate, which we call Aristotelianism. The creation of this remarkable structure of 26 propositions is a tour de force, one of the greatest achievements of Maimonides' career. If the entire subsequent history of Jewish philosophy and theology is a series of footnotes to the Guide of the Perplexed, most of those footnotes would be concentrated in this chapter. As I said, Maimonides does something very clever in the way he treats these propositions. He accepts Aristotelian eternalism for the sake of argument on a tactical and temporary basis. The reason Maimonides gave tactical assent to eternalism was to secure the three most important requirements of religion: God's existence, unity, and incorporeality, for both sides, the eternalists and the creationists, for Athens and Jerusalem. If the creationists were right, there must be a creator. If the eternalists were right, there must be a prime mover. In either case, God must exist. Now, it's important to recognize that this eternalism was the foundational core of Aristotle's entire system. By Maimonides' ultimate rejection of this eternalism, after having tactically assented to it, Maimonides sets up the destruction of that system. Now, I know what you're thinking. Proofs for the existence of God? Doctrinal requirements for religion? Whoever talks like that these days? But I'd ask you to try and keep an open mind about the things that medieval philosophers and theologians were concerned with. And as we look at it, we'll see that Maimonides does achieve a great deal in his drive to demonstrate the existence of God from a philosophic analysis of the way the world actually works, far more than we had any right to expect. Maimonides also seems to have a point that if you can't secure at least these minimum 4 requirements of religion, what kind of religion is it that you profess belief in? I think we should even pay attention to ancient scientific ideas, even though we may think that they're all outmoded. Joe Sachs, Aristotle's modern translator, wrote, "Scholarly articles on the physics seem at most to pass Aristotle on the head for having come to some conclusion not utterly in conflict with present-day doctrines. All the rhetoric that surrounds the physics of our time tells us that philosophic inquiry need not enter its territory, that here the philosophizing is over and done, that the best minds agree about everything, and that in any case, non-experts can't hope to understand enough to assess the evidence. Strangely, the physics of the 20th century is surrounded by the same air of dogmatic authority as was the school Aristotelianism of the 16th century." That's from Joe Sachs' Introduction to Aristotle's Physics, a Guided Study. Perhaps it's time for us to assess these issues again as science passes through another paradigm shift, already making 20th century physics look old. Now, we'll talk more about Aristotle's eternalism when we get to his 26 propositions, when we get to that part of the lecture series. But we note that unlike with rabbis who teach the works of Maimonides, most non-rabbinic academics who write about the Guide reject creationism. Now, that's not surprising. But what is surprising is that they also try to show that Maimonides secretly embraced eternalism and secretly rejected creation ex nihilo. It would be good and comforting for these secular academics if they could prove that Maimonides secretly rejected creation, but I found no evidence whatsoever to think that Maimonides did, and overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Nonetheless, we have to recognize that this scholarly divide is both remarkable and stark. In that regard, it's important for us to recognize that when we read great ancient and modern writers, even those whose writing is difficult and multi-layered, that we accord serious weight to what they actually said. We should hesitate before we try to search out dubious contradictions as justification for concluding that they believed something different from what they actually said. And that's especially true when that alleged secret doctrine easily conforms to our momentary opinions, prejudices, or fashions. Now let's talk about the problem students have with the propositions. This is the problem. When we first confront these 26 statements, none of which is longer than several lines, they're intimidating. Maimonides would assume that you would come to understand them because, like any good medieval student, you would have memorized them. And so he could call them out by number when he makes his arguments for divine existence. But we no longer learn through rote memorization. Modern students, fortunately, can print the propositions out or review them online in the Friedlander translation of the guide. My purpose in these videos is to give you what you need to grasp the meaning of each of them, restating them in my own words as we come to them. As I explain the propositions in these brief videos, I'm going to mostly avoid the great medieval debate surrounding them. I address that debate in more detail in my essay. In that debate, Maimonides' greatest antagonist was Rabbi Chazdai Crescus, who lived from 1340 through 1410, in his Or Hashem, the light of the Lord. We couldn't understand that debate between Crescus and Maimonides had it not been for Harry Austen Wolfson's critical edition, translation, and commentary called Crescus' Critique of Aristotle, now hard to find, but it is available in the links section of my Maimonides-guide.com website. I discussed Rabbi Crescus' critique in my essay. I found that, for the most part, Maimonides seemed to get the better of that debate. Although that intricate discussion will help you understand the propositions, I don't go through it in the video series. Now, as we journey through the propositions, the perceptive viewer should notice that some of them go well beyond the words of Aristotle, picking up late developments in medieval thought. The viewer should also see that each one of them is a small proof for the existence of God. In Volume 2, Chapter 1 of the guide, which is the next chapter after the introduction, Maimonides will combine these 26 propositions as though they were notes in a grand symphonic coda, compelling the mind and the heart to embrace the conviction of the first three truths of all religions: God's existence, divine unity, and incorporeality. The big idea behind the propositions is that the universe gives us evidence, available to anybody, that there must be one incorporeal being that starts all chains of motion and keeps everything going. The propositions show us that this being, God, is the necessary and sufficient reason for the existence of everything. I'll divide the 26 propositions into 7 conceptual groups, which is also how I'll divide up the videos. The last proposition, which is its own group, is the one that Maimonides only accepted tactically, eternalism. The 7 groups are the infinity propositions, 1 through 3, the motion propositions, 4 through 9, the force propositions, 10 through 12, the propositions of continuity and discontinuity, 13 through 16, the causation propositions, 17 through 20, and the propositions of matter and form, 21 through 25, and then finally eternalism, proposition 26, where Maimonides introduces the great debate between creation and eternalism. In this analysis, I address an identical set of questions regarding each proposition. How will Maimonides use the proposition? Why does he think that the proposition is true? And how should we resolve any problems with the proposition? In my next video, I'll introduce the first 3 propositions, which are the propositions of infinity. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the video series. Thank you very much for listening. You may contact me at scottmalexander@rcn.com with comments, questions, and criticism. Click on the description panel for this talk on YouTube to see links to the documents mentioned. Please visit my website, Maimonides-guide.com, to see my commentary essays on each chapter of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, now currently completed through the entire first book and including Maimonides' Introduction to Volume 2. At that website, you'll also find associated essays I've written, podcasts, videos, and important links. And of course, please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the YouTube notification bell. Thank you very much.